I spent 5 years living in Rome, Italy, and here's what they don't tell you. First, let me flag that I lived in Rome from 2010 to 2015, so maybe some of these things aren't still the case, but this is based on my experience when I was there. Number 1, public transportation strikes. I remember in Rome there was a thing called sciopero, and it was a day when the buses and trains would be running with limited to no service at all, and I remember waiting hours for the bus and getting to work late on these days. Sometimes I would know about the sciopero the day before so I could plan to start my commute earlier, but other times I wouldn't find out until the day of. Because the service was limited, I remember the buses and the trains would be jam-packed with people when they did actually come. Not a fun experience at all. On the topic of transportation, number 2 is if you decide to move to Rome, you can forget about an Uber. At the time when I was living in Rome, there were no Ubers, only taxis, which you can't flag down the way you would in New York, for example. You either have to call them in advance or you have to wait in line for them. I went back to Rome about a year ago and there still wasn't any Uber, at least not the way that we Americans know it, where it's someone driving you around in their own car. Rome has Uber, but it's more of an expensive limo car service. Number 3 is the lack of order. As someone who lived in America nearly her whole life, I can say I took for granted how structured we are. For example, when you step onto an escalator, you step on at the far right side so that if anyone wants to walk up the escalator stairs, they can do so on the left side without being blocked. But no, not in Rome. It's not uncommon to stand on an escalator and see it's fully blocked without any space to walk up. Or let's say if you're waiting in line at the supermarket, don't be surprised if you don't see a linear line and instead you just see a cluster of people waiting. Or if you're crossing the street, don't expect a signal to let you know that it's okay for pedestrians to walk. Be ready to cross the street on your own and at your own risk with good faith that the cars will stop for you. They usually do though. And on the topic of disorder, number 4 is the bureaucracy. In other words, many things have a complex structure with a lot of layers and procedures, and because of this, some things can take super long and can also have no set or clear instructions. For example, when it comes to applying for your permesso di soggiorno, which is basically your permit to stay in Italy, they say it's supposed to take 6 months or so to get it, but it can definitely take longer. I knew of someone whose permesso permit took 8 months and it made him lose a trip he had paid for, all because even after 30 calls and going to the office 8 times, nobody really checked his application. But then when he bought his girlfriend's Italian father, then magically people were willing to check his stuff and a month later he got his permit. Number 5 is if you're an American hoping to work in Rome, it can definitely be limited. Most Americans working in Rome are either English teachers or a tour guide. There are other possibilities like working at FAO, which is the Food and Agricultural Organization, but it's competitive and not usually open for hiring. So overall, you'd have a bit more of an advantage with finding work if you can speak Italian. And on the topic of working, number 6 is how often you get paid. I can't speak of every type of job, but as an English teacher, I was only getting paid once a month. I worked at a few different schools and they were all set up that way where the teachers would get paid at the end of the month. It was good to have a lump sum of cash, but it also forced you to budget your money to the T. Number 7, I guess, is subjective, but as someone who doesn't smoke, this was definitely a con for me. There are a lot of smokers in Italy, and smoking is allowed in places like nightclubs, for example. I remember sometimes just feeling so overwhelmed by the smell of cigarettes. The smell of cigarettes would be all in my clothes and all in my hair, and as a black woman with natural hair, I really couldn't afford to be washing my hair every day to get the smell out. Number 8 is the midday siesta, or as the Italians like to say that they stop per fare la pausa. So basically at around midday, all of the neighborhood shops would close and the workers would go home to have lunch and actually take a break, which was good for the shop workers, but not so good for the people who wanted to buy things from the shop. I had many instances where people would ask me where I was from, and to keep things simple, I would just say America, and they'd say, okay, sì, ma di dove sei? Translation, okay, but where are you from? And then I'd think to myself that maybe America was too broad and maybe they wanted to know where in America I was from. So I would say, from Boston. And after that, they'd say, but where are you originally from? And from there, I would tell them that my mom is from Barbados and my dad is from Honduras. But in my mind, I processed that their emphasis on questioning my origins as them associating Americans as the stereotypical blonde hair, blue-eyed people that they see on TV and in movies. I don't think they realized how much of a melting pot America is. But in their defense, I guess when you live in a country where practically all of the black people are African migrants, I could see why they would jump to the conclusion that I was also African. I'm digressing a little here, but this reminds me of how when I was in Italy, I once had a conversation with this guy who couldn't fathom that Beyonce was black. He swore up and down that she was mulatta. I think he wasn't processing that black people come in so many different shades and that most of us base our identity on our immediate family. Like, sure, my ancestors may be African, but I identify with my Caribbean culture because that's what I grew up with and I'm familiar with and accustomed to. On a lighter note, number 10 would be the lack of sauce. I don't know if this is an actual con, but as a foodie, I figured I would mention it. So I remember at the time I was in Rome, it was not uncommon to order something. For example, like if you went to McDonald's and you ordered a cheeseburger, it was not uncommon to get things that didn't have sauce on it. And by sauce, I mean even as simple as ketchup or mayo. A lot of the times the sandwiches would be the bread, the meat patty, cheese, maybe some lettuce, and that's it. Or even if you ordered a simple sandwich, for example, it would be like tomato and cheese and bread, which I guess that is not so bad. I say all that to say that if things are still the same in that case regarding sauce, don't be surprised if your sandwiches are a little dry, and just be ready to ask for ketchup or some sort of sauce. Is there anything about my experience with living in Rome that you'd like me to talk about, whether it's from a race, gender, class, etc. point of view, or are there any questions that you have for me? I'd be happy to make a video on it, so let me know below in the comments. Until next time, a dopo.